4 days after my father died, my husband quit his job. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Why keep working when your inheritance is enough for both of us?" Later that week, he called his mother and promised to buy her a mansion, and told his sister he was giving her $360,000 for her dream wedding. I stayed completely silent and let them plan their imaginary lavish lives. Then I received a call from my late father's estate attorney, and everything changed. My name is Elena, and I am 32 years old. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled my greedy in-laws, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that true character is revealed when money is on the table. My father Richard was a force of nature. He grew up with absolutely nothing and built a real estate empire across the Midwest through relentless hard work and a brilliant, calculating mind. To the business world, he was an intimidating mogul, but to me, he was just dad. He was my compass, my mentor, and my biggest supporter. When a sudden heart attack took him from me, my entire world shattered overnight. I am a senior financial auditor by trade, someone who deals in logic and numbers, but standing by his casket on a dreary Tuesday morning, I felt utterly untethered and lost. The rain poured down on the dark umbrellas of hundreds of attendees. Colleagues, competitors, and friends came to pay their respects to a man who had shaped the city skyline. I stood near the front, clutching a damp tissue, trying to hold myself together. My husband David stood next to me. We had been married for 4 years. From the outside, David appeared to be the perfect supportive partner. He worked in middle management at a logistics firm, always dressing impeccably and charming my friends. But that morning, as my father was lowered into the ground, I noticed something deeply disturbing about my husband. While I was trembling with overwhelming grief, David was practically vibrating with a completely different kind of energy. He kept shifting his weight, adjusting his expensive suit jacket, and sneaking glances at his phone screen. I glanced over and saw he was browsing a website for imported luxury sports cars, right there at my father's funeral. There was a subtle smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. When a prominent city developer approached to offer condolences, David shook the man's hand with an eagerness that made my stomach churn. He puffed out his chest, acting less like a grieving son-in-law and more like a man who had just won the lottery and was ready to collect his prize. I dismissed it at the time, blaming my own exhaustion and emotional fragility. I told myself people process grief differently. I could not have been more wrong. Exactly 4 days later, the true depth of David's deception hit me. The house was quiet. I had taken a leave of absence from my auditing firm to handle the initial shock of the loss and begin organizing my father's personal affairs. I was walking down the hallway carrying a cup of tea when I passed David's home office. The door was wide open. I stopped in my tracks. David was whistling a cheerful tune. He was pulling books off his shelves and tossing corporate files into a cardboard box. His company laptop sat on the desk, neatly wiped clean and wrapped in its carrying case. I stood in the doorway, confused. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice raspy from days of crying. David spun around, sporting a grin so wide it looked completely out of place in a house mourning a death. "Elena, baby," he chirped, tossing a stapler into the box. "I am packing up my home office. I am heading to the company headquarters in an hour to drop off my equipment." I frowned, stepping further into the room. "Why would you need to drop off your equipment? Are they upgrading your laptop?" He laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the walls. "No upgrade needed. I quit. I just sent my official resignation email to Human Resources and copied the Vice President. Effective immediately. I am completely done with that soul-sucking corporate grind." The mug in my hand suddenly felt very heavy. "You quit your job, without discussing it with me, without any warning." David walked over and placed his hands on my shoulders. His touch, which usually brought me comfort, now felt cold and manipulative. "Why keep working, Elena?" he said, looking me dead in the eye. "Your father left an estate worth $18 million. We are set for life. Your inheritance is more than enough for both of us. Why should I sit in a cubicle taking orders from middle managers when we can travel the world and live like royalty?" I stared at the man I had married, feeling a terrifying chill crawl up my spine. My father had not even been in the ground for a full week. The dirt on his grave was still wet from the rain. We had not seen the will. We had not spoken to the estate attorney. We had not even processed the death certificate. And yet here was my husband acting as if he had just hit a jackpot, abandoning his career to leech off a terrible tragedy. "You quit your job based on an assumption about my father's estate?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. My training as an auditor kicked in instantly. When you spot a major financial discrepancy, you do not react emotionally. You gather data. "It is not an assumption, baby," David sneered, waving a hand dismissively. "Richard was loaded, and you are his only child. It is simple math. We are rich. In fact, I am having my mother and my sister Chloe over for dinner tonight to celebrate. We need to start talking about upgrading our lifestyle. This house is fine, but we can afford something in the gated communities now. I want to look at properties this weekend." I looked at the cardboard box filled with his corporate ties and files. I looked at his smiling, eager face. He was not mourning my father. He was celebrating his payday. I realized in that fraction of a second that the man standing in front of me did not love me. He loved the $18 million he thought he was about to control. He saw my profound loss as his ultimate financial gain. "Okay, David," I said softly, forcing my face into a blank, emotionless mask. "Let us have dinner with your mother and sister tonight. We can talk all about the future." I walked out of his office, leaving him to his delusional packing. I did not scream. I did not throw my hot tea at him. I simply went back to the living room and waited. I knew David's family intimately well. I knew his mother Barbara's extreme entitlement and his sister Chloe's snobbish greed. If David was already acting like a newly minted billionaire, I needed to see exactly how far this delusion extended to his relatives. I needed them to lay all their cards on the table before I made my next move. They thought they had struck gold, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The doorbell rang exactly at 7 o'clock that evening. I stood in the kitchen wiping my hands on a towel and listened as my husband threw open the front door to welcome his mother and sister. The sheer volume of their greetings echoed down the hallway. There was no somber tone. There was no quiet respect for a house in mourning. They barged into my home with the boisterous energy of people arriving at a casino with a rigged roulette wheel. Barbara walked into the kitchen first, wearing her usual cheap perfume and a string of fake pearls she treated like crown jewels. She did not offer me a hug. She did not express a single word of sympathy regarding my father. Instead, she looked around my kitchen with a critical eye, running a finger over the granite countertop, as if inspecting a property she was about to purchase. Chloe followed close behind her, dragging her oversized designer knockoff handbag and flashing her modest engagement ring. Chloe had been complaining about her tight wedding budget for the past year, but tonight she carried herself like royalty. David strutted into the kitchen, holding a bottle of vintage champagne. I recognized the label immediately. It was a bottle my father had gifted us for our anniversary 2 years ago. A bottle worth nearly $800. David popped the cork without hesitation, the loud crack startling me. He poured 3 generous glasses, handing them to his mother and sister before raising his own. He did not offer me a glass. "To new beginnings," David declared, his eyes shining with unfiltered greed. "To freedom and to the brilliant future ahead of us." Barbara and Chloe clinked their glasses against his, cheering loudly. I stood silently by the kitchen island, watching the champagne bubble and fizz. I felt a cold detachment wash over me. My professional instincts completely overrode my grief. I was no longer a mourning daughter or a betrayed wife. I was a senior financial auditor observing a massive corporate fraud unfolding right in my own dining room. We moved to the dining table where I served the roast dinner I had prepared. David immediately took the head of the table, a seat he usually left for me when we had guests. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the expensive champagne, and smiled magnanimously at his family. "I have some incredible news," David announced, cutting into his meat. "I officially resigned from my job today. I am done with that miserable company." Barbara gasped, placing a hand over her heart in dramatic delight. "Oh, David, that is wonderful news. You have worked far too hard for far too long. It is about time you stepped into your true potential." She turned her gaze toward me, her eyes dripping with condescension. "Your father was a relentless workaholic, Elena. It is a tragedy he passed so suddenly, But we must look at the silver lining. He built a fortune so that his family could finally relax. At least his wealth is in capable hands now. Capable hands. The sheer audacity of her statement made the air in my lungs freeze. She was openly implying that David, my unemployed, mediocre husband, was the rightful steward of my father's $18 million real estate empire. Chloe slammed her fork down in excitement. So what does this mean, David? Are you guys moving? Are you buying a yacht? Tell me everything. David chuckled, waving his hand like a generous king granting favors to his loyal subjects. We are going to upgrade our entire lifestyle, Chloe. But before Elena and I make any major purchases, I want to take care of my family first. He looked at his mother, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. Mom, you have been living in that cramped two-bedroom condo for way too long. It is time for an upgrade. I want you to start looking at properties in the exclusive Hills District tomorrow. Find a luxury estate with a pool and a guest house. Do not worry about the price tag. I will buy it for you in cash. Barbara shrieked with joy, reaching across the table to grab David's hand. Tears of happiness actually formed in her eyes. Oh, my beautiful boy. I knew you would take care of your mother. I already have a few neighborhoods in mind. I want something with a grand staircase and a marble foyer. David nodded approvingly before turning his attention to his sister. And Chloe, I know you have been stressed about paying for your wedding. I know your fiancé is struggling to afford the country club venue. You only get married once, and I refuse to let my little sister settle for a cheap buffet in a rented community hall. Go back to the luxury wedding planner tomorrow. Book the country club. Order the imported orchids and the ice sculptures. I am giving you $360,000 to fund your absolute dream wedding. Chloe screamed, leaping out of her chair and running around the table to throw her arms around David's neck. She kissed his cheek repeatedly, thanking him profusely. She started listing off all the extravagant things she was going to add to her wedding package. A live band flying in from overseas, a custom designer gown from Paris, a 5-star honeymoon in Bora Bora. I sat at the opposite end of the table perfectly still. I did not drop my fork. I did not raise my voice. I simply watched them feast on the corpse of my father's legacy. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars dividing up an $18 million pie they had not even seen. They spoke about the money as if I was entirely invisible, as if my sole purpose on this earth was to act as a silent bank vault for their extravagant desires. Barbara looked at me over the rim of her champagne glass, a smug, victorious smirk plastered on her face. You really should eat, Elena. You look terribly pale, and do not worry about managing the finances. David is so smart with money. He will make sure everything is handled perfectly. You just need to rest and let him take the wheel. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my dinner. I chewed. I swallowed. I met her condescending gaze with absolute deadpan silence. I was analyzing them, cataloging their exact demands and their brazen entitlement. In the corporate world, this is what we call gross negligence and unfunded liabilities. They were making binding financial commitments based on phantom capital. I knew exactly what happened to companies that operated this way. They went bankrupt, and the executives went to prison. As Chloe began excitedly detailing the specific diamond cut she wanted for her upgraded wedding band, I felt a sharp vibration against my thigh. My phone was buzzing in my pocket. Keeping my hands below the edge of the mahogany dining table, I pulled the device out and unlocked the screen. The notification banner displayed a message from Martin, the senior estate attorney, who had handled my father's legal affairs for over 2 decades. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. Elena, we need to meet tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. I have finalized the documents regarding the Spendthrift Trust. Your father anticipated this exact scenario. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked up at David, who was currently promising his mother that she could hire a full-time private chef for her imaginary luxury estate. He was completely blind to the reality of his situation. He was standing on a trapdoor with a noose around his neck, and he was busy admiring the view. I picked up my wine glass, taking a slow sip. I let them talk. I let them dig their own graves because tomorrow the illusion was going to shatter into a million pieces. The morning sun pierced through the bedroom blinds, waking me long before David even stirred. I lay perfectly still, listening to his heavy breathing. The sheer audacity of the man sleeping next to me fueled a cold, clinical focus inside my brain. By 7, I was out of bed, dressed in a sharp-tailored suit and sipping black coffee at the kitchen island. David stumbled downstairs an hour later, whistling that same obnoxious tune from the day before. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not mention my father. He just grabbed an apple, tapped away on his phone, and announced he had errands to run. I watched him grab his jacket and rush out the front door like a kid heading to an amusement park. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I opened my secure laptop. As an auditor, I live by the mantra that if it is not documented, it does not exist. I set up dedicated folders for David, Barbara, and Chloe. I activated credit monitoring alerts on all our joint accounts and placed hard freezes on my personal assets. I was building a digital fortress. At noon, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet of my suburban street. I walked to the front window and watched a brand-new gleaming silver Porsche Carrera pull into our driveway. David stepped out of the driver's seat wearing cheap sunglasses and a grin that practically split his face in half. He patted the hood lovingly before jogging up the front steps. He burst through the door, tossing a set of heavy keys onto the console table. "Come outside, Elena," he shouted, echoing through the hallway. "Come look at our new toy." I walked out calmly, studying the ridiculous machine parked on our concrete driveway. It was beautiful, sure, but it was also a massive depreciating asset. "How did you pay for this, David?" I asked, crossing my arms. He waved his hand, brushing off my concern. "I financed it, baby." The dealership was hesitant at first since I just quit my job, but I showed the finance manager the news articles about your father's passing and the estimated value of his company. I told them the estate settles in a few weeks. They gave me a temporary financing plan at a steep interest rate, but who cares? We will pay off the entire balance in cash the second your trust clears. I stared at him, mapping out his exact level of stupidity. "You took out a high-interest auto loan based on a promise of future inheritance," I clarified, keeping my voice neutral. "Exactly," he beamed, oblivious to the legal trap he was setting for himself. "It is in my name, so do not worry about the paperwork. Just make sure the estate attorney hurries up." I nodded, suppressing a smile. I walked back inside and immediately documented the purchase. He was accumulating debt entirely under his own social security number based on a delusion. By mid-afternoon, my phone was vibrating endlessly with notifications from a newly created group chat named The Luxury Life. Barbara had taken it upon herself to invite me into her digital bragging session. The chat was flooded with photos of sprawling estates, marble foyers, and infinity pools. She was actively touring multi-million-dollar properties in the most exclusive zip codes. I scrolled through videos of Barbara marching through a massive kitchen, tapping her manicured nails on custom cabinetry. "I can already see myself hosting charity galas here," Barbara narrated in one of the videos, her voice dripping with artificial elite flair. "The realtor tried to tell me I need proof of funds to make an offer. Can you believe the nerve of that woman? I put her right in her place. I told her my son is inheriting a massive real estate empire and I will buy this entire block if I feel like it." I took a screenshot of every message, every photo, and every video. Barbara was treating seasoned real estate agents like peasants, burning bridges and making verbal promises she could never keep. She was so intoxicated by the scent of wealth she was completely detached from reality. She demanded I prepare a $2.5 million cashier's check by Monday. I replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji and saved the interaction to her dedicated folder. Chloe was not about to be outdone by her mother. An hour later, a barrage of emails hit my inbox. Chloe had forwarded me 5 different vendor contracts for her upcoming wedding. She had completely scrapped her modest community hall plans overnight. She had booked a premium country club, an imported floral arrangement service, a custom ice sculptor, and a 12-piece live band. The invoices totaled nearly $200,000. My phone rang, and I answered to hear Chloe screaming with excitement. "Elena, did you get the contracts?" she shrieked. "You need to wire the deposits by 5 o'clock today, or I lose the country club date." I pulled up her folder on my screen and typed a quick note. "Chloe," I said, adopting a tone of sisterly advice, "the estate assets are currently in probate. The lawyers are transferring the funds, and it takes a few days for the massive wire transfers to clear federal regulations. If you want to secure those vendors right now, you should put the deposits on your personal credit cards. Think about all the reward points you will get. We will reimburse you completely the moment the trust clears. There was a brief pause on the line. Are you sure I should use my cards? She asked, a hint of hesitation finally breaking through her greed. I have to max out both of them to cover these deposits. Absolutely, I assured her. You are practically a millionaire now, Chloe. Why wait and risk losing your dream venue? The hesitation vanished instantly. You are right, Elena. I am putting it all on my cards right now. See you soon. She hung up. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a protective shield. In less than 24 hours, my husband had financed a luxury sports car, his mother was verbally committing to a $2.5 million mansion, and his sister had just maxed out her credit cards on non-refundable wedding deposits. They were blindly sprinting toward a financial cliff and jumping off with massive smiles on their faces. I opened the master spreadsheet tracking their projected debt. The numbers were climbing into the stratosphere. They were spending money they did not have, borrowing against a future that did not exist. Every screenshot, every forwarded contract, every text message was securely backed up to an external server. I closed my laptop and checked my watch. The financial suicide mission was in full motion, and they had locked themselves inside the burning building. Tomorrow morning, I was scheduled to meet with Martin, the estate attorney. They thought the money was theirs for the taking, but they were about to learn exactly how my father protected his bloodline. I drove into the city the next morning, leaving David asleep and dreaming of his imaginary riches. The law offices of Sterling and Vance occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown high-rise. This was where my father built his empire on paper. Martin, the senior partner, and my father's closest confidant, greeted me at the heavy mahogany doors. He looked older since the funeral, carrying the weight of losing his best client and his oldest friend. He did not offer me empty platitudes or gentle condolences. He knew I operated on facts and data. We walked in silence to a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. We sat at opposite ends of the polished table. Martin slid a thick leather-bound folder across the sleek surface. He folded his hands and looked at me with a sharp, piercing gaze. Your father was a visionary, not just in commercial real estate, but in reading human nature. Martin began, his voice steady and serious. He saw through people. He knew their motivations long before they spoke a word. And Elena, he saw right through your husband from the very first handshake. My chest tightened, but I did not interrupt. Martin leaned forward and delivered the truth. He explained that Richard never trusted David. From the moment they met, my father saw the raw calculation hidden behind David's charming smile. Richard noticed how David always asked probing questions about property valuations and stock portfolios during holiday dinners, instead of asking about my life or my career. My father knew David was a parasite simply waiting for a wealthy host to die. I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. My father had protected me from beyond the grave. Martin opened the leather folder, revealing stacks of legal paperwork, stamped with official seals. The $18 million estate was not a simple lump sum transfer. It was never going to be deposited into a checking account for David to drain. The entire fortune was encased in an ironclad spendthrift trust. Martin explained the legal mechanics with surgical precision. A spendthrift trust is typically designed to protect a beneficiary from their own reckless spending habits. But my father had customized this specific document to protect me from a predatory spouse. I was named as the sole beneficiary and the sole trustee. However, there were massive legal tripwires built into the very foundation of the agreement. First, the capital could never be commingled with marital assets under any circumstances. The funds lived in a separate legal entity, entirely immune to divorce proceedings or spousal claims. David had absolutely zero legal authority to sign checks, authorize wire transfers, or leverage the trust for collateral on a loan. Every single dollar he had promised his mother and sister yesterday was legally inaccessible to him. I was writing checks on a bank vault that recognized him as a complete stranger. I stared at the paperwork, absorbing the magnitude of my father's foresight. David was acting like a newly minted billionaire, but legally he was still just a middle manager who had foolishly quit his job. Then Martin revealed the masterpiece. He called it the poison pill clause. My father had instructed Martin to insert a highly specific trigger into the final pages of the trust document. If David ever attempted to challenge the trust in family court, demand a lump sum payout, or force me to transfer the principal into a joint marital account, the entire trust would automatically freeze. All distributions would halt instantly. The assets would be locked behind a wall of corporate litigation that would take a decade and millions of dollars in legal fees to breach. David would bankrupt himself just trying to open the front door. I smiled, a genuine cold smile. The sheer brilliance of it was staggering. David thought he held the winning lottery ticket, but he was actually holding a live grenade. If he pushed me for the money, he would detonate his own financial ruin. I asked Martin to print me certified copies of the trust summary. I needed the exact legal wording for the inevitable confrontation. I was going to watch David read the fine print and realize his life was over. Martin watched me review the documents and asked a crucial question. He asked if David had already started spending money. I laughed softly, the sound echoing in the large conference room. I told Martin about the silver Porsche, the multi-million-dollar mansion tours, and the extravagant luxury wedding vendors. I explained how they were maxing out credit cards and signing verbal agreements based on a phantom inheritance. Martin shook his head in absolute disbelief. He advised me to let them continue building their mountain of debt. He stated clearly that the law only protects the innocent, and right now my in-laws were acting with malicious financial intent. They were committing fraud by representing themselves as wealthy heirs. I thanked Martin for his flawless execution of my father's final wishes. I gathered the certified copies and placed them securely into my briefcase. Walking out of that high-rise building, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The heavy, suffocating blanket of grief was entirely replaced by a sharp, tactical clarity. I held the ultimate trump card, and my hand was unbeatable, but I was not ready to play it just yet. David was reckless and arrogant, but his sudden resignation from a secure corporate job still bothered my analytical mind. Greedy men do not just quit their jobs without a backup plan unless they are running from something much worse. Why the sudden rush to leave the office? Why the immediate need to access my father's wealth? Before I went home to deal with my delusional husband and his greedy family, I needed to understand what pushed him over the edge so quickly. I sat in the driver's seat of my car and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name from David's former company, an old colleague from their accounting department who owed me a favor. I needed to dig into his employment records. If David was hiding something dark, I was going to drag it directly into the light. I started the engine, ready to uncover the dirt he left behind. I pulled my car into a quiet parking lot miles away from the law firm and dialed the number for Kevin. Kevin was a senior compliance officer at David's former logistics firm. We had worked together on a massive joint venture audit 2 years ago, and he deeply respected my meticulous approach to forensic accounting. The phone rang twice before he answered. His voice was hushed and frantic. He told me he could not talk on company time, but agreed to meet me at a dimly lit coffee shop on the edge of the industrial district during his lunch hour. I thanked him and drove straight to the location, my mind racing through every possible financial scenario. Corporate men with average salaries do not just walk away from their benefits and pension plans. They cling to them desperately unless they are forced out by something catastrophic. I arrived early and claimed a booth in the far back corner facing the door. Kevin walked through the diner entrance 20 minutes later, looking incredibly nervous. He slid into the booth across from me and immediately ordered a black coffee. He kept glancing around the room as if he expected corporate security to burst through the windows and drag him away. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I looked him dead in the eye and asked him directly what happened in David's department. I told Kevin about the sudden resignation, the bizarre celebration David threw the night before, and his sudden reckless spending spree. Kevin let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and professional dread. He explained that David's departure was not voluntary in the slightest. It was a forced exit orchestrated behind closed doors to avoid a massive public relations nightmare for the logistics firm. Kevin laid out the timeline with brutal clarity. 3 weeks ago, the internal audit team flagged a series of highly suspicious vendor payouts originating directly from David's specific user terminal. As a middle manager, David had the authority to approve invoices for external freight contractors up to a certain financial threshold. He had exploited that access perfectly. He had been creating dummy shell companies, assigning them legitimate-sounding vendor identification numbers, and routing company funds directly into offshore accounts he secretly controlled. It was a classic embezzlement scheme. It was simple but effective if the auditor was not paying close attention. But a recent software update caught the routing anomalies. The system flagged the matching Internet Protocol addresses, and the financial controllers swooped in without warning. I felt the blood drain from my face as my professional brain processed the severe magnitude of his actions. I asked Kevin for the exact figure. I needed the concrete data to understand the trap David was in. Kevin leaned forward across the table and whispered the number. $450,000. David had stolen nearly $500,000 over the course of 18 months. My husband, the man who constantly complained about the cost of organic groceries and lectured me on household budgeting, had been funneling a fortune into secret bank accounts. But the revelation did not stop there. Kevin explained the ultimate ultimatum the corporate board had delivered to David on the exact morning of my father's funeral. They had him dead to rights. They possessed the access logs, the bank routing numbers, and the forged digital signatures. The board offered David a brutal, high-stakes deal. He had to resign quietly immediately and forfeit his entire corporate pension. Then he had exactly 30 days to repay the entire stolen amount in one lump sum. If he wired the money back by the deadline, the company would sweep the entire situation under the rug and code his termination as a standard resignation to avoid a public scandal. If he missed the deadline by a single minute, they would hand the entire investigation file over to the federal authorities and press maximum criminal charges. They wanted their money back, and they did not care how he managed to secure it. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying absolute clarity. The picture they formed was utterly repulsive. David was not just a greedy husband celebrating a sudden windfall. He was a desperate trapped animal facing a decade in federal prison. The 30-day deadline was approaching fast. When my father died suddenly, David saw an immediate lifeline. He saw an $18 million estate and figured $450,000 was just a tiny drop in the bucket. He assumed he could easily manipulate me into transferring the cash to cover his tracks before I ever noticed the funds were missing. His sudden manic joy at the funeral was not just about buying sports cars or funding his sister's lavish wedding. It was the euphoric relief of a criminal who thought he had just found the perfect escape route. He was going to use my profound grief as a smokescreen to access my father's hard-earned wealth and save his own pathetic life. The sheer manipulative evil of his plan took my breath away. He had hugged me at the cemetery, while mentally calculating how fast he could liquidate my inheritance to keep himself out of handcuffs. I thanked Kevin, sliding $100 bill across the table to cover his coffee and his extreme discretion. I promised him I would never reveal his name to anyone. As I walked back to my car, the cool city wind felt incredibly refreshing. I was no longer dealing with a simple divorce or a greedy, entitled family. I was holding the key to a federal criminal case. I sat in my car and opened my secure laptop. I created a new heavily encrypted folder labeled Corporate Fraud. I typed out a detailed summary of everything Kevin had just told me, recording the timeline, the stolen amount, and the final repayment deadline. David had 14 days left before the company turned him over to the police. 14 days until the walls closed in and crushed him completely. He was currently driving around the city in a financed silver Porsche, charging thousands of dollars to high-interest credit cards while owing a massive unpayable debt to his former employer. He was entirely dependent on my father's trust fund to save him from prison. But I knew the truth. I knew the trust was legally locked. I knew the poison pill clause would freeze every single asset the second he tried to force my hand. He was completely out of options, and he did not even know it yet. I could have called the police right then. I could have exposed him and watched the authorities drag him away in broad daylight. But that would be far too easy. That would spare him the agonizing panic of realizing his grand master plan had spectacularly failed. I wanted him to feel the exact moment the trap snapped shut. I wanted him to exhaust every single lie and manipulation he had left in his arsenal. I wanted his mother and his sister to be fully financially committed to their own delusions before the floor dropped out from beneath them. I closed my laptop and put the car into gear. It was time to head back to the suburbs. I had a role to play. I needed to be the grieving, compliant wife for just a little while longer. I needed to smile and nod while David dug his grave a little deeper. As I merged onto the highway, my phone buzzed heavily against the center console. An urgent calendar alert flashed across the screen. Barbara had scheduled a private home tour for a luxury mansion and expected me to attend and bring my checkbook. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, a fierce sense of anticipation burning in my chest. The game was escalating beautifully, and I was ready to watch them lose everything. I drove back to my house, leaving Barbara to bask in the empty glory of a mansion she would never own. The moment I pulled into my driveway, another expensive vehicle was already blocking the path. It was Chloe's leased luxury sedan, parked haphazardly across the concrete. She was pacing on my front porch, clutching a massive, expanding folder against her chest and tapping her designer boots impatiently. I parked on the street and walked up the pathway, maintaining my perfectly composed facade. Chloe barely waited for me to unlock the front door before she shoved past me and marched directly into the dining room. She slammed the thick folder onto the mahogany table, causing the wood to vibrate. "Elena, we have a massive problem," Chloe announced, her voice shrill with entitlement. "My wedding planner just called, and she is threatening to give my date to a local tech billionaire unless we lock in the premium vendors today. I need you to wire $280,000 right now." I calmly hung my coat in the hallway closet and walked into the dining room. I did not rush. I did not flinch. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and leaned against the doorframe. $280,000 is quite a substantial deposit, Chloe, I said, keeping my tone conversational. Let us look at what you are trying to secure. Chloe frantically ripped open the folder and started throwing contracts across the table. They were printed on heavy cardstock with gold-embossed logos from the most exclusive event companies in the country. She pointed a manicured finger at the first invoice. "This is for the venue and the custom catering. They are flying in white truffles and Wagyu beef from Italy. That is 90 grand. This one is for the imported floral arrangements. The designer is bringing 50,000 rare orchids directly from a private greenhouse in Southeast Asia. That is another 70 grand. She tossed another contract toward me. "This is the down payment for the 12-piece live band that usually only plays for royalty. And this last one is for my custom gown. The designer in Paris needs $40,000 up front just to source the silk. David promised me my dream wedding, and you are holding up the funds. If you do not wire the money to these vendors before the banks close at 5, I am going to lose everything." I picked up the contracts one by one. I examined the strict legal clauses printed in the fine print. Every single vendor had a strict, non-refundable policy. If the contracts were signed and the deposits were paid, the money was locked. If the remaining balances were not paid 30 days before the event, the signee would be sued for breach of contract and held liable for the entire amount plus legal fees. It was a beautiful collection of financial landmines. Chloe was staring at me, expecting me to immediately pull out my laptop and drain my bank accounts. She tapped her foot, her face flushed with spoiled rage. "Well," she demanded, "open your banking app, Elena. We do not have time for you to read every single page." I set the contracts down and let out a long, perfectly crafted sigh. I looked at her with an expression of deep sisterly concern. "Chloe, I am completely on your side," I lied smoothly. "David made a promise, and we are going to honor it. You are going to have the most spectacular wedding this city has ever seen, but we have a severe logistical roadblock today." Her face scrunched up in panic. "What roadblock? David said you are practically a billionaire now. Just write the checks." I stepped closer to the table, adopting the authoritative tone I used during corporate audit meetings. I explained that an $18 million estate does not simply sit in a standard checking account. I told her that the federal government imposes strict monitoring on sudden massive capital transfers. The probate attorneys have placed a temporary 48-hour hold on all external wire transfers originating from my accounts. The banks need to verify the tax clearances before releasing liquid assets of this magnitude. If I try to wire $280,000 to 5 different foreign and domestic vendors, right now it will trigger an immediate fraud alert. The accounts will lock automatically, and your wedding vendors will cancel your date immediately due to flagged funds. Chloe gasped, clutching her face in horror. No, no, you cannot let that happen, Elena. My entire wedding will be ruined. My friends will laugh at me. You have to fix this right now. I placed a reassuring hand on the stack of contracts. There is a very simple solution, Chloe. You are David's sister. You are part of this new wealth. You need to act like a woman who controls her own destiny. The vendors do not care where the initial deposit comes from as long as it clears today. You have your own premium credit cards, do you not? She blinked rapidly, processing the suggestion. I mean, yes, I have my platinum cards, but my combined limit is only around $300,000. If I put all these deposits on my cards, I will be completely maxed out. My credit utilization will tank. I smiled, tapping the top contract gently. Chloe, think like a millionaire. You put the deposits on your personal cards right now. You secure the venue, the band, the flowers, and the dress today. You lock in your dream wedding under your own name. On Monday morning, when the federal hold lifts and the trust assets are fully liquid, I will not just reimburse you. I will wire you an extra 20% for the inconvenience. That is over $50,000 purely in profit for you. Plus, you will earn hundreds of thousands of premium credit card reward points. You could use those points to upgrade your honeymoon to first class for free. I watched the greed physically take over her brain. The panic in her eyes dissolved entirely, replaced by the intoxicating allure of free money and luxury travel. She was completely blinded by the illusion of wealth. She did not bother to read the non-refundable liability clauses. She did not stop to question why a supposed billionaire could not just call her bank manager to clear a flag. She only heard the words $50,000 in profit and free first-class flights. You are right, Elena, she said, her voice suddenly dripping with arrogant confidence. I am a wealthy woman now. I should handle my own affairs. I will put it all on my cards. I gestured toward the dining room chairs. Please make yourself comfortable. Call them right now before someone else steals your date. Chloe sat down and pulled 3 different premium credit cards from her wallet. She dialed the first vendor, putting her phone on speaker so I could hear her assert her dominance. She spoke to the luxury venue coordinator with the exact same elitist venom her mother had used at the mansion. She demanded VIP treatment, ordered them to add an extra caviar station, and confidently read off her 16-digit card number. I stood quietly in the background listening as the transaction was approved. She moved down the list. She called the floral designer, the live band, and the Paris dressmaker. One by one, she authorized massive, non-refundable charges. I watched her sign the vendor contracts, writing her name with aggressive, dramatic flourishes. She was legally binding herself to catastrophic debt. She was agreeing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for services she could never actually afford on a regular salary. Every time a charge cleared, she looked at me with a smug, triumphant smile. I returned the smile, projecting complete support, while my mind catalogued her financial destruction. When the final phone call ended, she gathered the signed copies of the contracts and shoved them back into her expanding folder. She stood up, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Make sure you have that wire transfer ready by Monday morning. Elena, she ordered, treating me like a personal assistant. I expect the full reimbursement plus my bonus by noon. Do not make me ask twice. I walked her to the front door, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. I will make sure you get exactly what you deserve, Chloe, I promised. She marched down the front steps, climbed into her leased sedan, and drove away. I closed the door and locked it. In a single afternoon, the mother had signed a fraudulent check for a multi-million-dollar mansion, and the sister had maxed out her credit on legally binding luxury contracts. They were both trapped in a burning financial cage, and David was completely unaware that his family had just joined him on the execution block. The board was set, and it was time to let David make his fatal mistake. The weekend passed in a blur of fake smiles and calculated silence. By Tuesday morning, the atmosphere in the house had shifted dramatically. The initial euphoria of David's sudden resignation was wearing off, replaced by a toxic nervous energy. The invisible clock ticking down his 30-day repayment window was growing louder in his head. He had 13 days left to wire $450,000 to his former employer or face federal prosecution. I was pacing the kitchen floors, drinking endless cups of black coffee and constantly refreshing the banking apps on his phone. "Elena," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed panic as I prepared my morning tea. "Have you heard from Martin? When exactly are the liquid assets being released? My mother has contractors calling her, and Chloe needs that reimbursement wire. The estate cannot just hold our money hostage." I kept my back to him, slowly stirring honey into my mug. I adopted a tone of absolute helplessness. "Martin said the federal tax auditors are taking their time, David. It is an $18 million estate. The government scrutinizes every single penny before they issue the clearance letters. It could take another week, or it could take a month. There is nothing I can do to speed up the federal government." I heard him curse under his breath. He slammed his coffee mug onto the granite counter. "A month. We do not have a month, Elena. We need liquid capital right now." I turned around, offering him a blank, innocent stare. "Why the sudden rush, David? You said we were set for life. The money is guaranteed. We just have to be patient." He forced a rigid smile, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Of course, baby. I know. It is just that I want to start our new life. Waiting is frustrating." He turned and walked quickly into his home office, shutting the door firmly behind him. I walked quietly down the hallway and stood outside his closed door. I could hear him frantically typing on his keyboard and muttering to himself. He was a trapped rat looking for a way out of a burning maze. He knew he could not wait a month. He could not even wait 2 weeks. He needed $500,000 immediately to cover his embezzlement tracks and keep himself out of a prison cell. And since he had zero assets of his own, he was going to have to leverage mine. The house we lived in was entirely in my name. My father had purchased it for me outright before David and I were even married. It was a beautiful property in a highly desirable neighborhood, carrying over $1 million in pure, untouched equity. It was a massive financial asset sitting right under David's nose. 2 days later, the mail carrier arrived at our front porch. David had run out to the grocery store, leaving me alone in the house. I walked out to the mailbox and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Hidden between glossy catalogs and utility bills was a thick, heavy envelope from a predatory private equity lending firm. These were the kind of lenders who authorized massive high-interest bridge loans in a matter of days, bypassing the strict regulations of traditional banks. They catered to desperate people who needed cash immediately and did not care about exorbitant interest rates. I took the envelope into my home office and locked the door. I held it up to the light. It was addressed to both of us. David had clearly submitted a joint application. Using a specialized steaming tool, I carefully loosened the adhesive on the flap and slid the documents out. It was an approval notice and closing contract for a $500,000 home equity line of credit against my property. The funds were scheduled to be wired into David's personal checking account by Friday. I flipped through the heavy stack of legal paperwork, my eyes scanning the severe financial penalties and the collateral clauses. Then I reached the final signature page. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. There at the bottom of the page, right next to David's frantic scrawl, was my signature. It was not a clumsy imitation. David had practiced. He had perfectly replicated the loops and angles of my handwriting. He had forged my signature on a legally binding federal financial document to steal $500,000 of equity from my home. His plan was brutally clear. He was going to use this loan to quietly pay off his former employer and avoid embezzlement charges. Then he planned to pay off this high-interest loan using my $18 million inheritance the moment it cleared probate. He thought it was the perfect crime. He thought I would never find out. A normal wife would have screamed. A normal wife would have confronted him, waving the forged documents in his face and demanding a divorce. But I was not a normal wife. I was an auditor and I had just been handed the ultimate weapon. By forging my signature on a loan document tied to real estate, David had just crossed a massive legal line. He had escalated from corporate embezzlement to outright mortgage fraud, identity theft, and wire fraud. These were severe felony charges carrying mandatory state and federal prison sentences. If I confronted him now, he could claim it was a misunderstanding. He could try to cancel the loan and destroy the evidence. I could not let that happen. The crime needed to be fully executed for the trap to be inescapable. I placed the documents flat on my desk. I used a high-resolution scanner to create perfect digital copies of every single page, making sure the forged signature was captured with crystal clarity. I uploaded the encrypted files directly to the secure server I shared with my attorney. I printed a physical backup and locked it inside my personal fireproof safe. Then I meticulously placed the original documents back into the private equity envelope. I applied a thin layer of specialized adhesive to the flap, sealing it perfectly so it looked completely untouched. I walked out to the kitchen and tossed the envelope onto the granite counter right on top of the junk mail where David would easily find it. 30 minutes later, the front door opened and David walked in carrying grocery bags. He set the bags down and immediately started sorting through the mail. I stood in the living room pretending to water my houseplants while watching his reflection in the hallway mirror. He saw the thick envelope from the lending firm. I watched his shoulders drop as a massive wave of relief washed over his entire body. He let out a long, shaky breath, gripping the envelope like it was a life preserver. He looked around the kitchen to make sure I was not watching, then quickly stuffed the envelope inside his jacket pocket. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the corporate auditors, outsmarted my father, and outsmarted me. I truly believed he had secured the cash to wipe his slate clean. I knew that once Friday came and went, David would feel invincible. He would believe his dark past was erased. He would go back to playing the arrogant billionaire husband, ordering me around and encouraging his mother and sister to spend themselves into oblivion. What he did not realize was that his forged signature was the final nail in the coffin for his entire family. His mother was legally bound to a mansion she could not buy. His sister was drowning in credit card debt for a wedding she could not afford. And David was about to be a twice-convicted felon with absolutely nowhere to run. The countdown was no longer about his corporate deadline. It was about mine. Friday arrived, bringing the exact deadline David had been banking on to save his miserable life. I sat at the kitchen island sipping my morning green tea and watched him refresh the banking application on his phone with an intensity that bordered on sheer madness. The private equity firm operated on their own convoluted timeline, meaning the massive wire transfer he desperately needed was delayed due to standard processing holding periods. David was sweating through his expensive dress shirt. He had completely miscalculated the speed of shadow banking, and his window for survival was closing fast. The morning mail delivery brought a thick, certified letter. I intercepted the stack first, recognizing the bold legal return address of David's former logistics company. I carefully opened the envelope, read the contents, and seamlessly resealed it. It was a final and absolute demand letter. The corporate board gave him exactly 72 hours to remit the stolen $450,000, or they were formally submitting the irrefutable evidence to the federal prosecutor. I left the letter sitting perfectly centered on his desk. When he finally walked into his office and tore it open, the color drained from his face entirely. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner reach for the lever. The pressure cooker was not just whistling for David. By Saturday morning, my phone started ringing relentlessly. Barbara was the first to attack my peace. Valerie, the real estate agent, had called her in a state of sheer panic. The $100,000 personal check Barbara wrote for the mansion deposit had bounced spectacularly. The sellers were furious, threatening to sue Barbara for breach of contract and take the luxury house immediately back to market. Barbara demanded I fix the situation instantly. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with entitlement. I calmly explained that the probate lawyers were dealing with weekend federal banking regulations, and the funds were still strictly locked. Barbara shrieked through the receiver, accusing me of intentionally ruining her aristocratic future. I listened to Barbara threaten to sue the bank for holding up her imaginary millions. She was so deeply invested in the lie that she believed her own fabrications. I advised her to ignore the real estate agent's calls, claiming that truly wealthy people never rush for the working class. She absorbed the terrible advice, eagerly proving that her arrogance was always her greatest weakness. I simply told her to hold off the agent until Wednesday, promising a hefty apology bonus for the delay. An hour later, Chloe stormed into my house, bypassing the doorbell entirely. Her face was blotchy from crying, and her designer makeup was running down her cheeks. The premium credit cards she had maxed out triggered massive automated fraud alerts. Two of her elite wedding vendors had already canceled, including the Paris dressmaker, because her payments were blocked by the credit card companies due to suspicious rapid activity. She demanded I wire the money, instantly screaming that her wealthy fiancé was starting to ask highly uncomfortable questions about her sudden financial crisis. Chloe threw herself onto my sofa, sobbing about how she had already mailed out preliminary save the dates, featuring the country club logo. If she lost the venue, she would be a laughingstock among her elite friends. She begged me to take out a personal loan to cover her tracks. I gently patted her back and told her that true wealth requires immense patience. I offered her a serene, unblinking smile. I told her the exact same story I told her mother. The estate was undergoing a standard federal audit, and my hands were legally tied until the paperwork cleared the government desks. I watched her spiral into a state of absolute despair, knowing she had voluntarily signed contracts that would bankrupt her before she even walked down the aisle. The weekend quickly turned into a psychological siege. They formed a united front of delusion and desperation. My phone vibrated endlessly with hundreds of aggressive text messages. Barbara sent passive-aggressive threats about how my father would be deeply ashamed of my financial incompetence. Chloe flooded my inbox with screenshots of angry emails from her wedding planner begging me to save her collapsing social reputation. David was the absolute worst of all. He paced the house like a caged animal, cornering me in the hallway, the kitchen, and the bedroom. He begged, he pleaded, and eventually he demanded that I call Martin, the estate attorney, and force him to release emergency funds immediately. David could not sleep. I listened to him pacing the hardwood floors at 3 in the morning, his footsteps heavy with impending doom. He tried to log into my personal banking portals, attempting to find any hidden liquidity he could drain. I had already locked him out of everything, changing passwords and establishing dual authentication protocols. He was a ghost wandering through a house he was about to lose, looking for a back door that did not exist. Through it all, I maintained a terrifyingly calm exterior. I became an impenetrable fortress of corporate deflection. I used complex legal jargon to pacify them, blaming obscure tax codes, Federal Reserve holding periods, and rigid fiduciary protocols. I never raised my voice. I never showed a single ounce of stress or hesitation. I made them cups of hot chamomile tea while they hyperventilated in my living room. I agreed with their frustrations, nodding sympathetically, while internally savoring every single second of their mounting agony. They were suffocating under the heavy weight of their own greed, and I was the one slowly cutting off their oxygen supply. Sunday evening arrived, and the house felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to level the entire block. David was sitting in the dark in his home office, staring blankly at the final demand letter from his former employer. He had barely 2 days left before he officially became a wanted fugitive. Barbara had resorted to turning her phone off completely because the real estate agent was threatening immediate legal action. Chloe was crying hysterically in her own apartment, terrified her fiancé would discover she was flat broke and cancel the wedding himself. The stage was perfectly set. The tension was stretched so thin it was ready to snap and destroy them all. I walked into David's dark office and placed a gentle, reassuring hand on his tense shoulder. I looked down at him and told him I had finally spoken to Martin, and we had a massive breakthrough. I instructed him to gather his mother and his sister first thing in the morning. I told him we were going to have a formal family meeting at the law firm to officially distribute the assets. David looked up at me with tears of pure relief in his eyes, completely unaware that I was leading him directly to the slaughterhouse. The transition from the relief of Sunday night to the paranoia of Monday morning happened before the sun even crested the horizon. I walked into the kitchen at 5 in the morning to find David fully dressed, pacing the length of the granite island. The tears of gratitude he had displayed the night before were entirely gone. In their place was a dark manic aggression. The reality of his corporate deadline had fractured his mind. He realized that a formal family meeting at a prestigious law firm meant lawyers' contracts and legal oversight. David did not want oversight. He wanted an immediate, untraceable wire transfer to save his own skin. He stopped pacing the moment I entered the room and blocked the doorway leading back to the hall. The loving husband facade he had maintained for 4 years melted off his face like hot wax, revealing the desperate, greedy parasite hiding underneath. He did not greet me. He did not offer a comforting touch. He slammed a stack of printed papers onto the counter. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was hastily printed legal advice from internet forums regarding spousal rights and inheritance laws. "We are not waiting for a meeting with your father's attorney, Elena." He snapped, his voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "I am done playing these bureaucratic games. I know my rights. I know exactly how much money is sitting in that estate, and I know I am legally entitled to half of it as your husband." I stood perfectly still, maintaining my calm exterior, while my analytical mind recorded every single word he spoke. "You are my husband, David," I said softly, keeping my tone deliberately fragile. "Why are you acting like this? We are going to the law firm today to sort everything out." I took a step closer, invading my personal space. His eyes were bloodshot and wild. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Do not play dumb with me. Lawyers only delay things. They ask questions and demand paperwork. I need liquid cash today. I need $450,000 wired directly into my private offshore account within 48 hours. If you do not authorize that transfer right now, I am walking out that door and heading straight to a divorce attorney." I let out a small fabricated gasp, clutching the collar of my robe. "You are threatening to divorce me over my father's estate." "I am not just threatening," he growled, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I will ruin you, Elena. I will drag this divorce out for years. I will claim half of the $18 million, half of this house, and demand exorbitant alimony. I put up with your father's condescending attitude for years, waiting for this exact payday. I earned that money. If you try to lock me out of it, I will drain every single asset you have in legal fees before you ever see a dime." The sheer audacity of his threat was almost breathtaking. He had no idea that inheritance was legally protected from marital property division. He had done a quick internet search and convinced himself he held the ultimate leverage. I was trying to extort his grieving wife using the threat of a messy divorce to cover up his own corporate felony. He did not stop there. He pulled out his phone and showed me messages from his mother and sister. Barbara was threatening to sue us both for the bounced check on the mansion. Chloe was threatening to stage a public protest at my workplace if her wedding vendors were not paid. "My family is falling apart because you are hoarding wealth," he yelled, running a hand through his messy hair. "My mother is facing a massive lawsuit and my sister is a laughingstock. You owe us this money. You owe me. You have 48 hours, Elena. Wire the funds or I take half of everything you own." I let a few tears well up in my eyes. I forced my lower lip to tremble, playing the role of the terrified, heartbroken wife to absolute perfection. "David," I whispered, letting my voice crack artificially. "Please do not do this. I love you. I do not want a divorce. I will give you whatever you need." His posture instantly shifted from aggressive to triumphant. He believed he had won. He believed his brutal intimidation tactic had successfully broken my spirit. He smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Then open your laptop right now and initiate the wire transfer." I shook my head slowly, wiping away the fake tears. "I cannot, David. I explained this all weekend. The Federal Reserve flagged the accounts due to the probate audit. If I try to wire $500,000 from my personal computer, the bank will freeze the transaction for fraud investigation. The only way to bypass the federal hold and move the money legally and instantly is to have Martin authorize the distribution directly from the firm." David howled, clearly frustrated but listening closely. "That is why I set up the meeting today." I continued, pouring honey over the trap. Martin has the legal authority to bypass the retail banking limits. If we go to the office and I sign the official distribution consent forms in front of him, he can issue certified cashier's checks or direct bank-to-bank transfers on the spot. You can walk out of that law firm today with the $450,000 in your hand. Barbara and Chloe can get their payouts too. We just have to follow the legal procedure to unlock the vault. I watched his greedy mind process the information. He weighed his desperate need for immediate cash against his fear of lawyers. The promise of walking out with a certified check today was too intoxicating for him to resist. The extortion had exhausted his last remaining brain cells. He completely bought the performance. Fine, David snapped, adjusting his collar and stepping back. We do it your way. But if I do not get that money today, I am filing the divorce papers tomorrow morning. Do not test me, Elena. I would never test you, David, I replied, wiping my eyes. I will make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve today. He nodded sharply, completely satisfied with his false victory. He pulled out his phone and barked orders at his mother and sister, telling them to dress in their best clothes and meet us at the downtown law firm. He bragged to Barbara that he had finally forced my hand and the money was guaranteed. He paced around the living room, making phone calls to luxury car dealerships, confirming that his wire transfer would clear by the afternoon. I was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality waiting for him. I turned away and walked up the stairs to get dressed. I selected a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, the armor of a woman going into corporate battle. I packed my briefcase with the certified copies of the Spendthrift Trust, the evidence of his forged loan documents, and the corporate embezzlement file. The ultimatum had been delivered, and the stage was flawlessly set. I was ready to burn his entire world to the ground. I drove into the city alone, leaving David to escort his mother and sister in his fraudulently financed sports car. The drive gave me exactly 45 minutes of absolute silence to center my mind and lock my emotions in a steel box. When I arrived at the Sterling and Vance building, Martin was already waiting in the marble lobby. We exchanged a brief understanding nod. I followed him up to the top floor and took my seat at the head of the massive glass conference table. I placed my briefcase on the polished mahogany surface and extracted 3 distinct manila folders. I aligned them with geometric precision. The trap was armed. 15 minutes later, the heavy oak doors swung open. The loud, obnoxious laughter of my in-laws echoed down the quiet, carpeted hallway of the prestigious law firm. They walked into the conference room like conquering royalty entering a surrendered city. The visual was absolutely nauseating. Barbara was draped in a brand-new, aggressively loud designer trench coat that still had the faint crease of a fresh price tag tucked inside the collar. She carried a bright red luxury handbag that cost more than her annual pension, undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card just hours before. Chloe strutted in wearing a silk blouse and a pair of imported stilettos, her nose turned up as she inspected the original artwork hanging on the law firm walls. She looked less like a bride-to-be and more like a lottery winner on a reckless spending binge. David led the pack. He had changed into a tailored Italian suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly. He reeked of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. He walked straight past me, entirely ignoring my presence, and approached Martin with an outstretched hand. He did not offer condolences. He did not ask how the legal team was handling the transition of my father's massive enterprise. He got straight to his delusional point. "Let us skip the formalities," Martin David said, shaking the senior lawyer's hand with a vigorous, condescending pump. "I know you guys charge by the hour, and I want to save the estate some money. We are just here to execute the asset distribution forms and pick up the certified checks. Elena told us the federal hold clears today. I have a routing number ready for the main wire transfer." Martin looked at David's outstretched hand, then slowly looked up at his arrogant face. The senior attorney had dealt with ruthless corporate raiders and hostile takeovers for 30 years. He remained completely unbothered by a desperate embezzler playing dress-up. "Please take a seat," Martin instructed, gesturing to the leather chairs lining the long table. "We have significant legal procedures to cover before any financial discussions can commence." Barbara scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she tossed her bright red handbag onto the pristine glass table. "Oh, please," she complained, dropping heavily into a chair. Do not try to bury us in legal red tape. We already know how much Richard left behind. We know exactly what we are owed. Just print the checks so we can leave. I have a private interior designer meeting me at my new mansion at noon, and I refuse to keep her waiting. Chloe chimed in, crossing her legs and inspecting her fresh manicure, and my wedding planner needs the venue deposit wired by 2 o'clock. She looked directly at Martin, treating him like a poorly performing bank teller. Can you expedite the transfer? I cannot afford any more banking delays. The floral designer from Paris is threatening to fly home if the funds do not clear her account today. I sat motionless on the head of the table. I rested my hands on top of the 3 manila folders. I watched them perform their symphony of greed. They were demanding millions of dollars from an estate. They had zero legal connection to barking orders at a senior attorney who billed $1,000 an hour. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. They were so blinded by the glow of my father's money, they could not see the massive legal walls closing in around them. David pulled out his phone and slapped it onto the table. He leaned forward, trying to assert dominance over the room. Look, we do not need a lengthy reading of the will. Elena and I are married. What is hers is mine. We agreed to a lump sum payout to cover some immediate family investments. Just slide the authorization papers across the table. We will sign them and get out of your hair. Martin opened his leather-bound portfolio. He did not rush. He did not react to their aggressive impatience. He removed a stack of watermarked documents thick with legal seals and notary stamps. He adjusted his glasses and looked at David with a gaze colder than ice. The distribution of Richard estates is not a simple banking transaction, Martin stated, his voice commanding absolute authority. The assets are governed by highly specific, irrevocable clauses. I am legally obligated to read the terms of the trust aloud to the primary beneficiary in the presence of all attending parties. Those are the rules. If you do not wish to listen, you are welcome to wait in the lobby. David clenched his jaw, shooting me a furious glare. He thought I was orchestrating this delay to punish him. He thought he still held the leverage of his divorce threat. He huffed, sinking back into his leather chair and crossing his arms over his chest. Fine, he snapped. Read the paperwork, but read it fast. I have a lot of things to handle today. Barbara sighed dramatically, pulling a compact mirror from her purse to check her lipstick. Chloe pulled out her phone and started scrolling through wedding venue photos, completely disregarding the solemnity of a will reading. They were thoroughly convinced this was just a tedious formality, a tiny hurdle before the floodgates of wealth opened and washed over them. They believed their aggressive posturing had successfully intimidated everyone in the room. I remained entirely silent. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The manila folders under my hands contained the complete destruction of the 3 people sitting across from me. Folder 1 held the unvarnished terms of the Spendthrift Trust. Folder 2 held the undeniable proof of David's corporate embezzlement and the impending federal deadline. Folder 3 held the scanned copies of the forged bridge loan documents, the ultimate felony that would lock him in a cage. They had walked into this room expecting to leave as millionaires. They had bullied, threatened, and manipulated me for days, believing my silence was submission. They mistook my tactical observation for weakness. They thought they had backed me into a corner with their demands and ultimatums. But as Martin cleared his throat and began to read the first page of the binding legal document, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The air grew thick and heavy. The words Martin spoke were complex, dense with financial terminology and strict legal boundaries. I watched David's face carefully. He was not a lawyer, but he worked in corporate management. He understood contracts. He understood clauses. And as Martin continued reading, I saw the exact moment the first drop of icy terror hit my husband's bloodstream. The calm before the storm was officially over. The execution was about to begin. Martin did not look up from the heavy parchment paper as his voice carried across the silent conference room. He read the primary designation clause with brutal articulation. The entire estate of Richard, including all real property, liquid capital stock portfolios, and corporate holdings, is hereby transferred into a fully irrevocable spendthrift trust. The sole, absolute, and exclusive beneficiary of this trust is my daughter Elena. The word exclusive hung in the air like a guillotine blade suspended by a thread. I watched David's knuckles turn stark white as he gripped the armrests of his leather chair. He was waiting for his name. He was waiting for the secondary beneficiary clause, the joint marital distribution, the spousal allowance. He was waiting for the golden ticket that would save him from federal prison. It never came. Martin turned the page, the crisp sound echoing loudly. Section 4 pertains to external claims and spousal access. Martin continued, his tone shifting from formal reading to direct explanation. He looked directly at David. Richard was exceptionally clear in his directives. The capital held within this trust cannot be commingled with any marital assets. It cannot be used as collateral for joint loans. It cannot be garnished by creditors attached to the spouse, and under no circumstances can it be distributed to cover the personal debts or liabilities of the beneficiary's husband. Furthermore, any distribution of funds is entirely at the discretion of the trustee, which is Elena. She holds zero legal obligation to disburse funds to anyone else in this room. The color completely drained from David's face, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. His eyes darted from Martin to the documents, and finally to me. The arrogant swagger he carried into the room evaporated instantly. He understood exactly what those clauses meant. He was locked out. The bank vault he had planned to raid was sealed behind a titanium wall, and my father had thrown away the key. Barbara slammed her manicured hand onto the glass table, shattering the quiet professionalism of the room. "I do not understand any of this legal gibberish," she shrieked, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Stop talking about trusts and clauses. Just tell us when the checks are being printed. My real estate agent is expecting a wire transfer by tomorrow morning, and Chloe has vendors waiting. We are family. David is her husband. We are entitled to our share of this money." Martin slowly closed the leather folder. He folded his hands precisely on top of it and offered Barbara a look of profound corporate pity. "Madam Martin," said his voice cold and unwavering, "you are entitled to absolutely nothing. Neither is your daughter. Neither is your son. The funds belong exclusively to Elena. If you have signed contracts or written checks based on the assumption of accessing this estate, you have committed severe financial misrepresentation. This law firm will not issue a single penny to cover your personal liabilities." Chloe gasped a sharp, desperate sound, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs. She looked at her brother, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "David, you promised me," Chloe cried, her voice cracking. "You told me to put $280,000 on my credit cards. You said we were millionaires. How am I going to pay for the venue? How am I going to pay for the dress? My fiancé will leave me if he finds out I am completely broke." David ignored his sister. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The reality of his impending criminal deadline was crushing his chest. He sprang up from his chair, pointing a trembling finger at Martin. "This is garbage!" David yelled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "This trust is completely vulnerable. I am her legal husband. I know marital law. If I file for divorce tomorrow, a judge will rip this trust wide open and grant me half of the estate. You cannot hide $18 million from a spouse. I will hire my own legal team, and we will tie this money up in family court until she is forced to settle. I want my cut." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I sat perfectly still with my hands resting on my 3 manila folders. I nodded at Martin, signaling him to deliver the final lethal blow. Martin adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair, observing David's aggressive posturing with absolute calm. "You are welcome to hire as many lawyers as you wish," David Martin replied smoothly. "However, I strongly advise you to understand the poison pill clause embedded in Section 9. Before you spend money you clearly do not have." David froze, his finger still pointing at the senior attorney. "What the hell is a poison pill clause?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave as pure dread washed over him. Richard anticipated that someone might attempt to leverage family court to break the trust. Martin explained. "Therefore, the trust contains a self-executing defense mechanism. If you file a lawsuit, challenge the validity of the trust, demand a lump sum payout, or attempt to force a settlement through divorce proceedings, the trust instantly and automatically freezes. All distributions will permanently halt. The estate will immediately transfer into a holding company defended by an aggressive corporate litigation firm on retainer. They have explicit instructions to drag out any legal challenge for a minimum of 15 years. They will bury your lawyers in thousands of motions, appeals, and discovery requests. You will be held liable for the estate's legal fees if you lose. If you attempt to fight this, David, you will bankrupt yourself within a month, and you will never see a single cent of the principal. The inheritance is entirely bulletproof. The room descended into a deafening dead silence. The magnitude of my father's brilliant trap fully materialized in front of them. There was no loophole. There was no negotiation. There was no aggressive legal maneuver David could pull to save his own life. If he walked away, he had nothing. If he fought, he would be crushed by a corporate legal machine designed to utterly destroy him. He was completely out of options. Barbara slumped back into her chair, clutching her chest, as if she were experiencing a physical heart attack. The illusion of her $2.5 million mansion vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of the fraudulent check she had written to a ruthless real estate agency. She was going to be sued for breach of contract. She was going to lose her own modest condo just to cover the legal penalties. Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. The premium vendors she had aggressively booked under her own name were going to bankrupt her. Her wealthy fiancé would undoubtedly run for the hills the second he discovered she was a financial fraud. Her entire social reputation was obliterated in a matter of minutes. But David was the true masterpiece of destruction. He stood frozen next to his chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. The corporate embezzlement deadline hovered over him like a grim reaper. He needed $450,000 in less than 48 hours, or the federal authorities would be knocking on his door. He had bet his entire freedom on my father's money, and he had lost everything. I watched the three of them suffocate under the crushing weight of their own greed. They had treated me like a silent bank vault. They had mocked my grief and celebrated my father's death. They thought they were untouchable. I slowly slid the first manila folder to the side and placed my hand firmly on the second one. The legal realization was only the first part of their punishment. It was time to show David exactly how much I knew about the dark secrets he left behind at his old office. Before I could even lift the cover of the second folder, the sheer gravity of their financial ruin finally snapped whatever fragile restraint my in-laws possessed. The polished quiet of the law firm conference room shattered into absolute chaos. Barbara was the first to explode. Her carefully crafted persona of the wealthy, sophisticated matriarch disintegrated instantly. She shot out of her leather chair so fast it slammed into the glass wall behind her. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her veins bulging against her neck. "You calculated little witch!" Barbara shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You set us up. You sat in my kitchen and smiled while I signed that mansion contract. You knew the check would bounce. You knew I did not have a dime to my name, and you let me walk right into a massive lawsuit." I kept my hands folded neatly on top of my files. "I did not force you to sign anything, Barbara," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You demanded to tour a house you could not afford. You treated the real estate agent like a peasant, and you wrote a fraudulent check based on absolute pure greed. I simply watched you make your own choices." Barbara slammed her fists onto the mahogany table, sending a shockwave through the room. "Do not give me that corporate nonsense," she screamed, her voice echoing down the hall. "I am your mother-in-law. You owe this family respect. I will be sued for breach of contract. I will lose my condo. I will be out on the street. You need to sell your own house right now and cover my deposit. You need to fix this, Elena. I demand that you pay for my house." The sheer entitlement was staggering. She was facing total financial ruin, and her immediate reaction was to demand I liquidate my personal assets to shield her from the consequences of her own arrogance. Before I could utter a single word of refusal, Chloe erupted. The glossy facade of the blushing bride-to-be collapsed into a hysterical, shrieking tantrum. Chloe grabbed her expensive expanding folder filled with premium vendor contracts and violently hurled it across the room. The thick cardstock papers scattered across the floor like falling leaves. She collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, her heavy designer makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "My life is completely ruined," Chloe wailed, burying her face in her hands. "Do you have any idea what you have done to me? I maxed out every single credit card I own. I owe hundreds of thousands of dollars to the most elite event planners in the city. If I cancel now, they will sue me for the remaining balances. They will blacklist me from every country club. My fiancé will find out I am completely broke and he will leave me. His family hates poor people, Elena. They will call off the engagement the second they realize I cannot pay for the imported orchids." Chloe lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen with desperate fury. She glared at me as if I had personally destroyed her future. "You promised me a wire transfer," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "You told me I was practically a millionaire. You are a disgusting liar. You ruined my wedding on purpose because you are jealous of me. You have always been jealous of my relationship with David, and now you are punishing all of us because your miserable father died." The vile nature of her accusation hung heavily in the air. She was weaponizing my father's death to justify her own reckless vanity. She truly believed her imported flowers and high society status were more important than my grief. Martin, the senior attorney, cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. He looked thoroughly disgusted by the display of rabid greed unfolding in his conference room. "I must ask you to lower your voices," Martin instructed firmly. "This is a professional legal environment. If you continue to yell and make demands of my client, I will have security escort you out of the building." Martin's warning only served to ignite the main powder keg. David, who had been standing frozen in sheer terror, finally snapped out of his paralysis. The looming deadline for his corporate embezzlement repayment had entirely broken his mind. He realized that screaming about real estate and wedding flowers was completely useless. He needed cold hard cash right this second to stay out of federal prison. David lunged forward, planting both hands firmly on the glass table and leaning his entire upper body toward me. The polite, charming husband I had married was gone. The man staring at me was a cornered predator willing to do absolutely anything to survive. "Shut up!" David roared, silencing his mother and sister instantly. He did not care about Barbara's lawsuit or Chloe's ruined wedding. He only cared about saving his own skin. He locked his bloodshot eyes onto mine, his face twisted with aggressive menace. "Listen to me very carefully." Elena, David snarled, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "I am not playing these legal games anymore. I do not care what your dead father wrote on a piece of paper. I am your husband. We are legally married. I demand that you dissolve this spendthrift trust immediately." I looked up at him, maintaining a perfectly steady gaze. "I cannot dissolve an irrevocable trust, David. That is the entire point of the legal structure." He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the water glasses. "Do not lie to me," he bellowed. "There is always a loophole. There is always a backdoor in these corporate documents. You are the sole trustee. You have the power to break it. You will instruct Martin to draft an emergency dissolution order right now. You will transfer $450,000 into my personal checking account before we leave this building. If you refuse, I will make your life a living hell. I will drag your name through the mud. I will destroy your career. I will take everything you own." The sheer desperation in his voice confirmed exactly what my former colleague Kevin had told me. David needed exactly $450,000. He had just confessed his exact target number in front of a senior attorney, effectively verifying his own embezzlement timeline. I was so blinded by panic he did not even realize the massive mistake he had just made. Barbara chimed in, nodding vigorously in agreement with her aggressive son. "You heard him, Elena. You are his wife. Your duty is to your husband first. Dissolve the trust and give him the money he deserves. If you truly loved him, you would not hesitate." Chloe wiped her running mascara, nodding frantically. "Just sign the papers, Elena. Give us the money so we can fix this disaster. Stop being so selfish." I sat back in my chair, observing the three of them. They had completely stripped away their masks. There was no pretense of love, no feigned sympathy for my loss, no basic human decency. They were a pack of starving wolves, trying to tear open a steel cage to reach the meat inside. They were demanding I dismantle my father's final protective act, just to shield them from the catastrophic consequences of their own toxic decisions. I slowly looked at Barbara, then at Chloe, and finally locked eyes with David. I let the heavy silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, allowing their desperate, heavy breathing to fill the room. I am not dissolving the trust, I stated, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. I am not paying for a mansion. I am not paying for a wedding. And David, I am absolutely not giving you $450,000 to replace the money you stole from your former employer. The air in the room completely vanished. David's jaw dropped open, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. The aggressive predator vanished instantly, replaced by a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He realized in that exact moment that I knew everything. I slowly moved my hand and opened the second manila folder. I pulled a thick stack of crisp white legal documents from the manila folder and slid them across the smooth glass surface of the conference table. They came to a halt exactly an inch from David's trembling fingertips. I placed a heavy silver pen right on top of the stack. "These are the divorce papers, David," I said, my voice projecting absolute corporate authority. "They are effective immediately. You will notice the terms are incredibly straightforward. You are waiving all rights to alimony. You are waiving any claim to my personal property, my retirement accounts, and my father's estate. You will leave my house today with nothing but the clothes you brought into our marriage. You will sign on the dotted line right now." David stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. The color that had drained from his face suddenly rushed back in a violent wave of crimson rage. He looked at the silver pen and then looked back at me, his jaw clenching so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. He let out a harsh, erratic laugh, trying to mask his rising panic with a pathetic display of bravado. "You think you can just hand me a piece of paper and make me walk away?" David spat violently, shoving the documents back across the table. "You are out of your mind, Elena. I am your husband. I have rights. You think mentioning my old job is going to scare me into signing away millions of dollars. You do not know anything. You are just guessing. I will hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in this city. I will drag you through family court for the next 10 years. I will bleed your precious trust fund dry with legal fees, and I will take half of everything you own. I am not signing anything." Barbara quickly rallied behind her son, finding a renewed spark of false confidence. "Listen to him, Elena," she warned, crossing her arms defiantly. "You cannot intimidate us. David is a successful corporate manager. He has resources. You are just a bitter, grieving woman throwing a temper tantrum. We will take you to court, and we will win." Chloe nodded eagerly, backing away from her own financial despair to cling to her brother's. Aggressive posturing. "You owe us," she chimed in. "You ruined my wedding. David is going to make you pay for everything." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact with my soon-to-be ex-husband. I simply moved my hand to the third and final manila folder resting on the table. I flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. "I do not guess, David," I stated flatly. "I am a senior financial auditor. I deal in absolute, undeniable facts. And the fact is, you are not a successful corporate manager. You are a desperate, cornered felon." I pulled out the high-resolution printed spreadsheets and the internal corporate access logs. I began laying them out on the glass table one by one, creating a visual timeline of his complete destruction. "Let us talk about your resources." I continued, my tone dropping into a lethal clinical register. "Let us talk about the dummy shell companies you established over the past 18 months. Let us talk about the specific vendor identification numbers you manipulated using your middle management clearance. Let us talk about the $450,000 you funneled directly into offshore accounts to fund a lifestyle you could never actually afford." David's breath hitched audibly. His chest stopped moving. He stared at the spreadsheets, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He recognized the formatting immediately. They were the exact internal audit logs from his former employer's finance department. The undeniable proof of his guilt was sitting right in front of his mother and his sister. "You did not resign, David," I said, pressing my finger against the final printed document. You were forced out in a closed-door meeting on the exact morning of my father's funeral. The board caught the routing anomalies during a software update. They gave you a 30-day deadline to repay the stolen funds in a single lump sum, or they would hand the entire file over to the federal authorities. That deadline expires in less than 48 hours. I slid the final piece of paper across the table. It was a perfect high-definition copy of the final demand letter that had arrived at our house just days prior. You thought you hit the jackpot when my father died, I stated, watching the absolute horror paralyze his entire body. You thought you could use my grief as a smokescreen to raid my inheritance and pay off your corporate debt before the police got involved. That is why you were smiling at the cemetery. That is why you were rushing to buy a sports car. You were trying to build an illusion of wealth to hide the fact that you are about to be indicted for massive corporate fraud. The conference room fell into a deathly suffocating silence. The air pressure dropped entirely. Martin sat perfectly still, acting as the ultimate silent witness to the execution. Barbara and Chloe stared at the documents on the table, their mouths hanging open in stunned disbelief. The realization was hitting them with the force of a physical blow. Their golden boy, their ticket to the upper class, was not a wealthy executive. He was a common thief on the verge of a massive federal prison sentence. David, Barbara whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying new reality. What is she talking about? Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not steal from your company. David could not speak. He could not look at his mother. He stood paralyzed, his hands gripping the edge of the glass table so tightly his joints were turning white. The aggressive predator who had threatened to drag me through family court just 2 minutes ago was completely gone. He was nothing but a hollow, shattered shell of a man. Chloe backed away from her brother, her eyes darting between the audit logs and David's pale, sweating face. "You lied to us," she gasped, stepping toward the door. "You told me to max out my credit cards. You told me we were millionaires. You are a criminal, David. You ruined my life to cover up your own crimes." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass table. I commanded the entire room without raising my voice a single decibel. "You are not going to hire ruthless divorce attorneys. David," I instructed, my words striking him like physical blows. "You are not going to drag me through family court, and you are certainly not going to demand a single cent of alimony. Because if you do not sign these divorce papers right now, I am going to pick up my phone and call the federal prosecutor myself. I will hand over every single piece of evidence I have gathered. I will personally ensure that your corporate board does not sweep this under the rug." I picked up the heavy silver pen and held it out to him. "You have a choice to make right this second," I told him, offering no mercy and no hesitation. "You can sign these papers, waive all your marital rights, and walk out of this law firm as a free man for the next 48 hours. Or you can refuse, and I will have Martin summon the authorities to this exact room before you can even reach the elevator." David stared at the silver pen. He was completely trapped in a burning room, and I was the only one holding the key to the exit. He reached out with a trembling hand. His trembling fingers hovered inches above the heavy silver pen, but he did not pick it up. A sudden, desperate shift occurred in his eyes. The sheer panic that had paralyzed him just seconds ago morphed into the frantic, reckless bravado of a cornered animal making one last suicidal lunge. He violently snatched his hand back and slammed his palm flat against the glass table. He let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, shaking his head, as if he had just figured out a massive joke. "You are bluffing, Elena," he spat, his voice gaining a false layer of confidence. "You are trying to intimidate me with corporate audit logs, but you do not understand how these things work. The board gave me a 30-day window. I still have 48 hours left to remit those funds. It is a private corporate matter. The police are not involved yet. If you call the federal prosecutor right now, they will laugh in your face because the company has not officially filed criminal charges. You are holding a completely empty gun." Barbara seized the opportunity to revive her own shattered delusions. She sat up straighter, pointing a manicured finger at me. "He is right," she declared, her voice shrill and triumphant. "You are just trying to scare him into signing away his marital rights. David is a smart man. He knows the law better than you do. You cannot just call the police and have him arrested over an internal company dispute. We are not signing anything, and we are not leaving this office without a settlement." Chloe chimed in, emboldened by her mother's sudden surge of arrogant defiance. You are pathetic, Elena. You thought you could trap my brother with some printed spreadsheets. David is going to take half of your father's estate, and he is going to pay off his corporate debt. Then he is going to pay for my wedding. You have absolutely no power here. I sat perfectly still, absorbing their collective delusion. They were clinging to the edge of a crumbling cliff, convinced they could somehow defy gravity. David smirked, leaning back in his leather chair and crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at Martin, then looked back at me, radiating a toxic, repulsive arrogance. You played a good game, Elena, David sneered, but you overplayed your hand. I am not signing those divorce papers. I am going to walk out of this firm, and I am going to secure the capital I need. I already have a massive financial deal in the pipeline that clears by Friday. I do not even need your trust fund anymore. I am going to pay off the corporate board, clear my name, and then I am coming after you for every single asset you own. You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the final compartment of my briefcase and withdrew a sealed plastic sleeve containing a thick stack of high-grade financial documents. I slid the sleeve across the smooth mahogany and glass surface until it rested directly in front of his crossed arms. You are entirely correct, David, I stated, my voice dropping into a lethal clinical register. The corporate embezzlement is an internal matter for the next 48 hours. The board gave you a window to repay the $450,000. That is a corporate extortion tactic to avoid bad press. But you just mentioned a massive financial deal in the pipeline clearing by Friday. I believe we need to discuss exactly how you plan to secure that capital. David's arrogant smirk faltered slightly. He uncrossed his arms and stared down at the plastic sleeve. I pulled out the crisp, highly detailed scanned copies of the private equity lending contract. I arranged the pages in a perfectly neat row facing him. Let us talk about the $500,000 home equity line of credit you initiated last week. Last week, I continued driving the knife directly into his chest. Let us talk about how you applied for a massive high-interest bridge loan using my primary residence as the sole collateral. Let us talk about the predatory shadow banking firm you contacted because you knew a traditional bank would instantly reject an unemployed man with zero verifiable income. The color vanished from his face completely. His jaw went slack. The boastful posture collapsed as if someone had just severed his spine. I slid the final piece of evidence across the table. It was the signature authorization page, blown up and printed in high definition. I tapped my index finger directly onto the ink. This is my house, David, I said, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. It is a property legally deeded entirely in my name, purchased by my father long before we were ever married. You have zero equity in that estate. Yet here is a binding federal financial document securing $500,000 against my property. And right here at the bottom of the page is my signature. I leaned forward, bridging the physical distance between us. My gaze locked onto his terrified, bloodshot eyes. A signature I never provided. I whispered the words, hitting him with the force of a freight train. You forged my name, David. You replicated my handwriting perfectly on a federal lending document to steal $500,000 of equity from my home. You plan to use this fraudulent loan to quietly pay off your corporate embezzlement before the Friday deadline. Then you plan to pay off this bridge loan, using my father's inheritance, the moment it cleared probate. You thought it was the perfect crime. You thought I would never check the mail. The conference room plunged into a suffocating, deathly silence. Martin, the senior attorney, removed his glasses and stared at David with sheer, unadulterated disgust. Barbara and Chloe sat frozen, their mouths hanging open, incapable of processing the monumental scale of his criminality. Corporate embezzlement is a white-collar crime. David, I continued, delivering the final execution. The company might have given you 48 hours to pay it back. But forging my signature on a real estate loan is mortgage fraud. It is identity theft. It is federal wire fraud. Those are severe, absolute felonies carrying mandatory state and federal prison sentences. There is no 30-day grace period for mortgage fraud. There is no corporate board willing to sweep this under the rug. I am the victim of this crime, and I hold the undeniable physical proof. David began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, gasping for air that his lungs refused to process. He looked at the forged signature page, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. I pushed the divorce papers directly over the forged loan documents. I picked up the heavy silver pen and held it out to him one final time. "You have run out of bluffs, David." I stated, my voice completely void of mercy. "You have run out of lies and you have run out of time. You have exactly two options right now. Option one is you sign these divorce papers. You waive your right to alimony. You waive your claim to any marital assets, and you walk out of this building with absolutely nothing. Option two is you refuse to sign, and I hand this comprehensive forgery file directly to the police officers I already stationed in the lobby downstairs. They will arrest you for federal mortgage fraud right here in this conference room, and you will go straight to a maximum security prison." David stared at the silver pen. His hands shook so violently the table vibrated. He looked at his mother, who had turned her face away, entirely paralyzed by shock and impending ruin. He looked at his sister, who was openly weeping in her chair, completely destroyed by the realization that her brother was a massive criminal. He had no allies. He had no leverage. He was entirely broken. He reached out with a trembling, sweating hand. He took the silver pen from my fingers. Without saying a single word, he leaned over the divorce papers. His breathing was ragged and shallow, sounding like a dying machine. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name on every single dotted line, surrendering every last ounce of his imaginary empire. David lifted the heavy silver pen from the glass table and pressed it against the stark white paper. His hand shook violently as he scrawled his signature across every single dotted line, surrendering his marital rights, his claim to my property, and his imaginary billionaire future. The scratching sound of the pen tip was the only noise in the room. When he finished, he dropped the pen. It rolled across the glass and clinked against my manila folder. I calmly collected the signed divorce decrees, sliding them safely into my briefcase. The execution was complete. David was legally entirely severed from my life. As David slumped back into his chair, a hollow shell of his former arrogant self, the sheer gravity of the situation shifted across the table and slammed directly into his mother. Barbara had been sitting frozen, her face drained of all color. She stared at the signed divorce papers and then slowly turned her gaze toward me. The artificial elite persona she had paraded around the luxury mansion just days ago completely evaporated. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch. She was an unemployed widow holding a massive fraudulent real estate contract. My phone buzzed against the table, but I ignored it. Barbara's phone, however, erupted from inside her bright red designer handbag. The loud, obnoxious ringtone pierced the stifling silence of the conference room. Barbara flinched as if she had been struck. She opened her bag with trembling fingers and pulled out her device. The name flashing on her screen was Valerie. The luxury real estate agent had been calling her non-stop since Monday morning. Barbara stared at the screen, her eyes wide with mounting terror. She looked at David, pleading silently for a rescue that he could no longer provide. David did not even look at her. He was staring blankly at the floor, completely consumed by his own impending corporate doom. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the glass table. "Answer it, Barbara," I instructed, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathy. "You are a wealthy woman buying a $2.5 million estate. It is incredibly rude to keep your real estate agent waiting." Her thumb hovered over the screen. She pressed the green button and slowly brought the phone to her ear. She did not even get a chance to say hello. Valerie's voice was so loud and laced with absolute fury that I could hear every single word from across the table. Valerie screamed through the receiver, demanding to know why the $100,000 earnest money deposit check had bounced spectacularly. The bank had flagged the transaction as fraudulent due to insufficient funds. Valerie informed Barbara that she was standing in a room with the sellers and their aggressive corporate attorneys. They were not just canceling the purchase agreement. They were preparing to file a massive lawsuit for breach of contract and intentional financial fraud. Writing a bad check for $100,000 is a severe criminal offense. Valerie told Barbara she had until the end of the business day to wire the penalty fees, or the sellers were calling the district attorney to press charges for check fraud. Barbara let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. She stammered into the phone, begging for an extension, promising that there had been a simple banking error with her son's massive inheritance. Valerie cut her off brutally. She told Barbara she knew the inheritance was a lie and promised to destroy her financially for wasting their time and taking the luxury property off the market. The call ended with a sharp, definitive click. The phone slipped from Barbara's hand, clattering onto the glass table. She grabbed her chest, struggling to breathe as a full-blown panic attack seized her lungs. She looked at me, tears ruining her heavy makeup. "Elena, please," Barbara begged, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic whine. "You have to help me. I am your family. They are going to sue me. They are going to send me to prison. I do not have $100,000. I do not even have $10,000. You have 18 million. You can make this go away right now. Just write a check. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize for everything." I stood up slowly, buttoning my charcoal suit jacket. I looked down at the woman who had spent the last 4 years mocking my career, demanding I serve her, and celebrating my father's death. "You are not my family, Barbara," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the large room. "I am just a bitter, grieving woman throwing a temper tantrum. Those were your exact words less than 20 minutes ago. I suggest you call your own lawyers. You signed a legally binding contract under your own name. You wanted to play the role of a wealthy aristocrat, and now you get to pay the aristocratic price." I turned to Martin, thanking him for his flawless execution of the trust, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. The fallout for Barbara was swift and absolutely merciless. Over the next 3 weeks, the seller's attorneys launched a devastating legal assault. They filed civil lawsuits for breach of contract and contacted the local authorities regarding the fraudulent six-figure check. Desperate to avoid a criminal trial and a mandatory prison sentence for felony check fraud, Barbara was forced to liquidate every single asset she possessed. She hired a discount defense attorney. She could barely afford draining her meager retirement savings just to keep herself out of handcuffs. The legal fees and the negotiated settlement penalties consumed her entirely. She was forced to put her prized 2-bedroom condo on the market for a rapid cash sale at a massive loss. The place she had called a cramped peasant box just days prior was suddenly the only thing standing between her and a concrete jail cell. The cash from the rapid sale was instantly swallowed by the seller's aggressive legal team to settle the breach of contract and drop the criminal charges. Barbara was left with absolutely nothing. Her fake pearls, her ridiculous faux fur coats, and her snobbish entitlement were completely stripped away. She packed her cheap knockoff bags and was forced to move into a tiny, rundown studio apartment in a terrible neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. She had to take a low-wage job working the register at a discount retail store just to afford her groceries. She spent her days scanning clearance items for customers, completely erased from the high society life she had so desperately tried to steal. She had built her dream castle on a foundation of pure greed, and I simply let her lock herself inside before the entire structure collapsed and buried her alive. While Barbara was learning the harsh reality of retail labor, Chloe was experiencing an even more spectacular public demolition. She had marched out of my house that fateful afternoon, carrying a folder full of legally binding contracts bearing only her signature. She had authorized non-refundable charges across 3 different premium credit cards, convinced that my father's estate would wash away her massive debts by Monday morning. When Monday came and went, followed by the catastrophic revelation in the law firm conference room, Chloe was left holding a financial ticking time bomb. The countdown to her social destruction moved with terrifying speed. The elite wedding vendors she had bullied and commanded required their second installment payments exactly 30 days prior to the event. When the luxury country club attempted to process the next charge of $40,000, Chloe's credit card company immediately declined the transaction. The imported floral designer sent an urgent email demanding the remaining balance for the rare orchids. The 12-piece live band issued a formal notice of cancellation. The Parisian dressmaker refused to ship the custom silk gown and threatened international litigation for the unpaid labor costs. Chloe panicked. She tried to dodge the phone calls, ignoring the mounting pile of certified demand letters piling up in her mailbox. She frantically attempted to secure a personal loan from a high-risk online lender, but her credit utilization was entirely maxed out. Her credit score had plummeted into the abyss overnight. The elite vendors did not simply cancel their services. They executed the aggressive penalty clauses buried in the fine print she had been too arrogant to read. Chloe forfeited over $140,000 in initial deposits. Furthermore, the contract stipulated that she was personally liable for the lost revenue of the canceled dates. Chloe had tied her own noose with luxury thread and the floor had just vanished beneath her feet. The walls closed in on her perfectly curated high society life. Her wealthy fiancé Preston belonged to a family of generational wealth. His parents employed a small army of wealth managers and private attorneys who monitored everything connected to their family name. It took less than a week for Preston's family accountants to notice the massive civil lawsuits and debt collection notices being filed against their future daughter-in-law in the county courts. Preston confronted Chloe in the lobby of his luxury penthouse. Chloe, cornered and desperate, reverted to her usual tactic of lying. She sobbed hysterically, claiming that I had maliciously stolen her wedding funds and frozen her bank accounts out of pure spite. She played the helpless victim, begging Preston to pay off the angry vendors and save their flawless wedding day. But old money families do not survive by writing blind checks to hysterical people. Preston's father ordered a comprehensive private background check on Chloe's entire family. The results were absolutely devastating. The investigators uncovered Barbara's pending check fraud lawsuit. They unearthed the details of David's corporate embezzlement and his forced resignation. The report painted a crystal-clear picture of a desperate, broke, and entirely fraudulent family attempting to scam their way into the upper class. Preston did not yell or scream. The wealthy rarely do when they are disgusted. He simply handed Chloe the investigative report and demanded the custom engagement ring back immediately. Chloe refused to take it off, screaming that she loved him and that the background check was a fabricated lie. Preston simply signaled his private security guard, who stepped forward to escort her off the premises. Realizing she had absolutely no leverage, Chloe slipped the 5-carat diamond ring off her trembling finger and dropped it into his waiting palm. He officially called off the wedding, canceling the remaining society invitations with a cold, detached email blast that went out to every single one of their wealthy friends. Chloe was entirely excommunicated from the elite circles she had spent years trying to infiltrate. Her former bridesmaids created a private group chat specifically to mock her spectacular downfall. The country club revoked her guest privileges. She was forced to file for personal bankruptcy to stop the aggressive wedding vendors from garnishing her modest corporate salary. The bankruptcy destroyed whatever was left of her financial future, ensuring she could not even rent a decent apartment in the city. She ended up moving into a cramped basement unit, having to sell her designer clothes and luxury handbags to consignment shops just to afford basic utilities. She spent her nights scrolling through social media, watching her former elite friends attend lavish parties she would never again be invited to. Her dream of becoming a wealthy socialite was completely eradicated, replaced by the crushing reality of a ruined reputation and a mountain of legal debt she would carry for the rest of her life. While the women in David's family were crushed by the immediate financial fallout of their own vanity, David had managed to delay his ultimate destruction by a few more days. He had signed the divorce papers and vacated my property within 2 hours of leaving the law firm. He took only his clothes packed into garbage bags because he could not even afford a proper suitcase. He retreated to a cheap weekly rental motel on the industrial edge of the city. I thought signing the divorce decree had bought him a brief window of freedom. He was dead wrong. The Friday deadline set by his former corporate board arrived without a single cent hitting their accounts. David had no bridge loan. He had no inheritance. He had no wealthy wife to manipulate and drain. The board of directors at the logistics firm did exactly what they promised they would do if he failed to remit the stolen $450,000. They did not negotiate. They did not grant a weekend extension. They picked up the phone and called the federal prosecutor. Because David had crossed state lines with the digital wire transfers, the case was immediately elevated to a federal level. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided the corporate headquarters, gathering the internal audit logs, the matching internet protocol addresses, and the dummy shell company records. The evidence was pristine and incontrovertible. David had left a massive digital footprint that even a junior financial investigator could follow blindfolded. The authorities spent the weekend building a bulletproof indictment for massive corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud. I did not have to actively seek out the conclusion of his story. It was delivered directly to my television screen on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my living room, the exact room where David had threatened to destroy my life, sipping a glass of expensive red wine, when the breaking news alert flashed across the local broadcast. The anchor announced a major arrest in a corporate fraud scandal involving a prominent regional logistics firm. The screen cut to live footage recorded just an hour prior. There was David, the man who had sneered at me in my own kitchen, who had tried to extort my father's legacy, who had celebrated a funeral with a bottle of vintage champagne. He was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and wrinkled jeans, looking disheveled and completely broken. Two federal agents flanked him, their grips tight on his arms. His hands were secured securely behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated his pale, terrified face. The authorities were marching him out of a dingy motel room door right past a vending machine and a broken ice maker. The reporter standing in the foreground detailed the staggering amount of stolen money and the elaborate shell companies David had used to funnel the cash. The broadcast noted that he was being held without bail as a severe flight risk due to the offshore accounts involved in the scheme. The reporter looked directly into the camera and stated that the disgraced former executive was facing up to 20 years in federal prison. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, watching the footage loop as the anchor moved on to the next segment. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual affection or regret. I felt the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of absolute justice. The universe had not punished David. I had not punished David. His own rampant, insatiable greed had meticulously built the cage he was now locked inside. I had simply refused to pay his bail. His life as a free man was entirely over. He would lose whatever miserable assets he had left to pay for a public defender who would ultimately advise him to take a plea deal. He would spend the best years of his life in a concrete cell, stripped of his tailored suits, his luxury cars, and his arrogant delusions. He would sit in the dark and realize that he threw away a secure, comfortable life for a shortcut that led directly to ruin. The execution was flawlessly complete. The slate was wiped entirely clean, and the predators who tried to consume my life were completely eradicated. 365 days passed since that broadcast aired. A full year had cycled through the calendar, bringing changing seasons and an entirely new existence. I woke up on a crisp autumn morning in the exact same house where my marriage had violently unraveled. Yet the space no longer felt tainted. The lingering shadows of David's arrogant pacing were completely gone. The aggressive demands of his mother and the hysterical sobbing of his sister had faded into absolute nothingness. I had hired a premium design firm to completely renovate the interior, stripping away the dark, heavy furniture David preferred and replacing it with clean, modern lines and vast open spaces. The house finally reflected the woman who actually owned it. I walked into my newly remodeled kitchen, poured a cup of rich, dark coffee, and stood by the massive bay windows overlooking the garden. There was no anxiety tightening my chest. There was no ticking clock counting down to a financial disaster. There was only absolute, profound peace. I had survived the fire and emerged forged in steel. I finished my coffee, dressed in a sharp-tailored ivory suit, and drove my own luxury sedan into the heart of the financial district. I did not buy a ridiculous, depreciating sports car like my ex-husband. I bought a reliable, armored machine that reflected steady, undeniable success. I pulled into my reserved parking space beneath a gleaming skyscraper of glass and steel. This was the new headquarters of Vanguard Financial Auditing, my firm. Over the past 12 months, I had worked closely with Martin to strategically utilize the dividends generated by my father's spendthrift trust. I never touched the principal capital, respecting the brilliant protective walls my father had built. Instead, I used the massive quarterly yields to expand my boutique auditing practice into an elite financial fortress. I leased the entire top floor of the high-rise, hiring a small army of the most ruthless, brilliant forensic accountants and legal analysts in the city. I transformed my personal survival tactic into a corporate weapon. I walked out of the elevator and stepped onto the plush carpet of my lobby. My administrative staff greeted me with crisp, professional efficiency. The atmosphere was charged with purpose. We were not just balancing ledgers or preparing tax documents. We were actively hunting predators. My firm now specialized in a highly specific, lucrative niche. We executed complex wealth preservation strategies and aggressive asset tracing for high-net-worth individuals facing hostile divorces. People came to me when they realized their spouses loved their bank accounts more than their marriage vows. I walked into my corner office, taking my seat behind a massive mahogany desk. My lead analyst handed me a fresh dossier. It was a new client named Jonathan, whose wife was attempting to drain his business assets into hidden offshore shell companies before serving him with divorce papers. She thought she was being clever, using obscure crypto exchanges and dummy corporate accounts to hide her tracks. I opened the file, running a manicured finger down the list of transactions. I recognized the exact same greedy, sloppy patterns David had used. I smiled a dangerous, knowing smile. I instructed my team to freeze the marital accounts, place immediate legal liens on her secondary properties, and draft an airtight financial injunction before the sun went down. We were going to blindside her with a devastating legal counterstrike. Watching the trap spring shut on another financial parasite brought me a deep, unparalleled satisfaction. I was taking the most traumatic, agonizing experience of my life and converting it into an impenetrable shield for others. My reputation within the financial sector exploded. High-profile divorce attorneys kept my firm on speed dial. Wealthy entrepreneurs and business moguls consulted me before signing prenuptial agreements. I became the ultimate authority on asset protection and predatory financial behavior. Industry magazines requested interviews, and corporate boards invited me to speak on panels regarding internal embezzlement safeguards. I stood at the absolute pinnacle of my field. I was widely respected, highly feared, and incredibly wealthy. But unlike the toxic individuals who tried to destroy me, my wealth was completely legitimate. It was built on a foundation of unshakable integrity, meticulous hard work, and the brilliant protective legacy my father had left behind. The sheer financial power I wielded was intoxicating, but it never corrupted my core values. I remembered what it felt like to be targeted, to be viewed as nothing more than a human automated teller machine by the people who were supposed to love me. That memory kept me perfectly grounded. I refused to let money dictate my morality. I established a pro bono division within my firm, dedicating a percentage of our massive profits to helping lower-income individuals untangle themselves from financial abuse. We offered free forensic accounting services to victims of domestic financial control, ensuring that spouses who hid money to trap their partners were ruthlessly exposed in family court. I was giving back to the community and breaking the chains of economic manipulation at every single level of society. My father had taught me how to protect capital, but my own suffering taught me how to protect people. When the workday concluded, I stood by my office window watching the city lights flicker to life against the twilight sky. The chaotic, terrifying nightmare of the previous year felt like a distant, blurry movie. The people who had tried to consume my life were completely erased from my reality. I had not heard a single word from Barbara or Chloe. They were trapped in their own miserable consequences, irrelevant and forgotten. David was sitting in a federal penitentiary, wearing a standardized uniform and staring at concrete walls. He had traded an easy, comfortable life for a shortcut that led directly to a cage. He had absolutely zero power over me. He could not touch my finances, my property, or my peace of mind. I was completely unburdened by toxic attachments, free to navigate the world exactly as I saw fit. I held the reins of my own destiny. My father had given me the ultimate financial armor, but I had forged my own sword. I had learned how to fight, how to strike back, and how to build an empire out of the ashes of a burning marriage. I turned away from the window, grabbing my briefcase and preparing to head home to my sanctuary. The war was definitively won, and the victory was absolute. Stepping out of the glass doors of Vanguard Financial Auditing, I inhaled the crisp evening air. The city hummed with life around me, a rhythmic symphony of traffic and distant sirens. A year ago, the sound of this city felt overwhelming, a loud reminder of the chaos invading my personal life. Tonight, it was just the soundtrack to my absolute freedom. I walked toward my armored sedan, unlocked the heavy doors, and slid behind the steering wheel. The soft leather wrapped around me, providing a quiet, comfortable space for reflection before the drive home. Looking back at the catastrophic wreckage of my marriage, I realized the most profound lessons are never taught gently. They are forged in the scorching heat of betrayal and hammered into your soul by the very people who promised to protect you. My journey from a grieving daughter to a ruthless financial executor taught me an undeniable, terrifying truth about human nature. Money does not change people. It unmasks them. It strips away the polite society smiles, the loving husband facades, and the supportive family dynamics. When massive wealth and profound grief intersect, the resulting explosion burns away every single lie. Grief makes you incredibly soft. It makes you desperate for comfort and connection. Predators like David and his family possess a radar for that exact vulnerability. They look at a shattered heart and see an open vault. David did not suddenly become a monster on the day of my father's funeral. He was always a calculating parasite. He simply decided the mask was no longer necessary because he thought the payout was finally guaranteed. He believed my sorrow would blind me to his staggering greed. He severely underestimated the daughter of Richard. If you take anything away from my story, let it be the absolute non-negotiable necessity of financial independence. Love is a beautiful concept, but love does not pay legal fees. A marriage certificate is not a substitute for financial literacy. You must know exactly where every single dollar in your household originates and where it goes. You must read the fine print on every contract you sign. You must secure your personal assets with the same aggressive vigilance you would use to defend your physical life. My father's spendthrift trust was a brilliant legal shield, but my own forensic auditing skills served as my sword. I did not rely on the police to figure out David's embezzlement. I did not wait for karma to punish Barbara and Chloe for their sheer entitlement. I gathered the evidence. I organized the data. I executed the trap perfectly because I understood the financial mechanics of their destruction. You must be your own strongest advocate. You cannot afford the luxury of financial ignorance. The second lesson is perhaps the hardest to swallow for those raised to value family above all else. You must develop the capacity to enforce absolutely ruthless boundaries. Society tells us that we must forgive our relatives, that we must keep the peace, that blood is thicker than water. That is a manipulative lie designed to keep victims chained to their abusers. Toxicity does not deserve a seat at your dinner table just because you share a last name or a marriage license. When someone shows you they view you as a commodity, believe them the first time. Cutting off my in-laws was not an act of cruelty. It was an ultimate act of self-preservation. Forging my signature on a federal lending document was not a marital dispute. It was a severe felony. Demanding I fund a luxury wedding while I mourned my father was not a miscommunication. It was pure predatory entitlement. You do not negotiate with predators. You lock them out and throw away the key. Never apologize for protecting your peace. Let the bridges you burn light your way forward. Today my life is completely untethered from the parasitic demands of people who viewed me as an automated teller machine. I sleep soundly in a house that belongs exclusively to me. I run a highly lucrative firm that protects innocent people from the exact nightmare I endured. I am not a victim. I am a survivor who learned how to weaponize the truth. I refuse to let my grief turn me into a target. Instead, I used my analytical mind to dismantle the individuals who attempted to dismantle me. The feeling of driving home, knowing that every single asset I own is legally fortified, brings a sense of power that nobody can ever diminish or steal. The reality is that everyone will eventually face a moment where their trust is violently betrayed by someone they love. The defining factor of your life is not the betrayal itself, but the specific method of your retaliation. Do you crumble and surrender your hard-earned resources to keep the peace? Or do you stand your ground, gather your undeniable evidence, and force the predators to choke on their own unchecked greed? I chose to fight back. I chose to wield my financial knowledge like a scalpel cutting away the cancer that had infected my life. I won because I refused to let grief make me weak. I won because I realized my own immense value. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment of total clarity where money completely exposed the true intentions of your friends or relatives? Have you ever had to enforce a brutal, unyielding boundary to protect your own mental and financial well-being from toxic family members? Tell me your survival stories in the comments section below. Share the exact moment the mask slipped and you realized you had to fight back. Your experiences inspire others to stand up and reclaim their power. If my journey of justice and corporate revenge resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a harsh reminder of their own unshakable worth. And absolutely make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of resilient strength and absolute merciless justice. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset and it is always worth fighting for. The devastating collapse of my marriage taught me a harsh, undeniable truth. Money does not change people. It unmasks them. When immense wealth and profound grief collide, the resulting explosion burns away every comfortable lie. We are taught to forgive family and keep the peace at all costs. That is a manipulative trap designed to keep victims chained to their abusers. Toxicity does not deserve a seat at your dinner table simply because you share a marriage license or a last name. You must develop the capacity to enforce absolutely ruthless boundaries. Cutting off my predatory in-laws was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. Furthermore, love is a beautiful concept, but it does not pay legal fees. You must secure your personal assets with the same aggressive vigilance you use to defend your physical life. I refused to let my grief turn me into a target. I used my financial knowledge to dismantle the predators who attempted to destroy me. Have you ever enforced a brutal boundary to protect your well-being from toxic family members? Share your survival stories in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of absolute justice.